I'm Janet, and I would like to tell you a tale. Though I've been married for 30 years, allow me to take you back to our first meeting. My father was a man of action while I was growing up. He had his own firm and constructed reasonably priced homes for those in need. I believed I had found my happily ever after when I met Tom. My dad was a kind man, so when we were married young, he gave us a house as a wedding present. I gave birth to my son, Jake, 2 years into our marriage. I immersed myself into becoming a mother, focusing all of my love and care on Jake. When Jake was around 3 years old, I broached the subject of returning to the workplace. Tom would have none of it. He did not even glance up from his newspaper when he continued, "Janet, we've talked about this. It's your responsibility to look for our boy and maintain our property. Remember that we made that agreement. Even though I don't recall consenting to it, I made a note of it. The struggle wasn't worthwhile." Over time, Tom became increasingly dissatisfied with his employment. Although he was a sales manager, he desired more. He returned home one evening in a terrible temper, banging doors and cursing to himself. "What's wrong?" As I followed him into the kitchen, I questioned. His cheeks flushed with rage, he spun around. "What's not right? I'll explain the issue to you. Even though I've been working hard at that firm for years, they still didn't give me a promotion. Another young hotshot succeeded instead." I attempted to console him, but he dismissed me. Then a thought flashed into his eyes. "Your dad," he grasped my shoulders and murmured. "I could get a nice job from your dad. I mean, you could talk to him, right?" I wavered. Although my dad had always kept his personal life and career apart, it was difficult to refuse Tom's expression. I said, "I'll talk to him," and I did. After considerable persuasion, Dad decided to give Tom a try. I believed it would take care of every issue we had. Whoa, I was incorrect. For a time, everything were going well. Tom appeared content and was earning a comfortable living. But his mother, Martha, had poisoned my life. When she first unexpectedly dropped by, I was knee-deep in washing. When the doorbell rang, there she came, all phony smiles and critical gaze. With a cooing, "Janet, dear," she pushed by me and into the home. While I was in the area, I decided to pay a visit. "Do you not mind at all?" She was in the living room, rubbing her finger down the coffee table and scowling at the dust before I could respond. Shouting, "Oh my," was her response. "My darling, you really ought to maintain things more tidy." Tommy should have gotten better than this. My teeth were clenched, and I faked a grin. I was about to finish cleaning. "In fact, would you mind having something to drink?" Her hand was waved off dismissively. "I'll make my own tea, please." You return to your daily activities, whatever they may be. And it was only the start. Martha started to visit us frequently, usually without warning, and always with criticism. I attempted to discuss it with Tom, but he always sided with her. That was how life continued for a while. After getting Jake ready for school, cleaning the home, preparing meals, and handling Martha's unexpected visits, I would wake up. Then the night arrived that would alter everything. With a contorted expression of anger, Tom stormed through the door. I was preparing dinner in the kitchen when I almost dropped the dish. "Tom, what's wrong?" With great care, I put down the dish and asked. His suitcase smashed on the counter as he stormed into the kitchen. "Your father is a despot and a tyrant," he spit out. "He treats individuals like nothing more than a source of humiliation." It stunned me. As far as I knew, my dad had always been fair and kind. "What topic are you discussing? What took place?" Tom paced the kitchen with his fists clenched. "Today, I stood up for an employee that your father was mistreating. You are aware of what he did." I was fired by him. In that very same manner, My thoughts were racing. This sounded nothing like my dad. There has to be an error. We can work this out, I'm sure of it. Let me speak with him. No, Tom growled, causing me to recoil. You're not conversing with him. You will never again speak with any of them. Your parents are deceased as far as we are concerned. Do you comprehend what I'm saying? I silently agreed, too shocked to protest. I was afraid since Tom had never talked to me in this way before. After that day, our lives took a significant turn. Tom was different this time around, colder and more in charge, but he still made good money when he got another job. Even Jake was no longer permitted to see his grandparents, and he banned me from getting in touch with my parents. Years went by. Growing up, Jake was a quiet, contemplative youngster who appeared to be aware of the stress in our house. I was devastated and proud of him at the same time when he was accepted to a different city's college. Proud of what my kid has accomplished, but heartbroken at losing the only person who could make my life tolerable. After Jake left, things got worse. Tom and Martha became more demanding, more belittling. They treated me like a servant, constantly criticizing and ordering me around. One afternoon, Martha barged in as usual. "Janet," she barked, "I need you to take me shopping, and then you're going to cook dinner for me and my friends. We're having a little get-together tonight." I was exhausted, having spent the morning scrubbing the house from top to bottom. "Martha, I'm really tired. Can we do this another day?" She looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "Tired? You sit around this house all day doing nothing. Now get your purse. We're leaving in 5 minutes." I wanted to argue, to stand up for myself, but years of submission had worn me down. I got my purse and followed her out the door, hating myself for my weakness. When Tom came home that night, he was furious to find the house in disarray and no dinner ready. "What have you been doing all day?" he demanded. "This place is a mess, and where's my dinner?" I tried to explain about Martha's demands, but he wouldn't hear it. I went to bed that night feeling worthless, wondering how my life had come to this. Little did I know, things were about to take an even more dramatic turn. As the years passed, my life became a suffocating routine of servitude. Tom and Martha seemed to take pleasure in belittling me at every turn. I was nothing more than their personal maid, cook, and punching bag for their frustrations. "Janet, these dishes aren't clean enough," Tom would bark, inspecting a plate with exaggerated disgust. "Do them again, and this time try to be less useless." Martha was no better. She'd sweep into our house unannounced, her critical eyes taking in every imperfection. "Oh dear," she'd say with a dramatic sigh. "I don't know how my Tommy puts up with such a slovenly home. You really should try harder, Janet. A good wife would." Their words cut deep, chipping away at my self-esteem day by day. I felt worthless, trapped in a life I didn't recognize. The worst part was I was too ashamed to tell anyone. When Jake would call from college, I'd put on a cheery voice. It was easier to pretend. When Jake came to visit, Tom would transform into a different person. Attentive, kind, even loving. It was like watching a skilled actor take the stage, and it left me feeling more confused and alone than ever. Then one ordinary Tuesday, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Hello," I said hesitantly. "Janet, is that you?" The voice on the other end was older, rougher, but unmistakable. My father. My heart raced. I hadn't spoken to him in years. "Dad," I whispered, glancing around as if Tom might appear at any moment. "Janet, I need to tell you something. It's your mother. She's very ill. The doctors, they're not optimistic." I wanted to rush to her side immediately, but Tom's words echoed in my head. "Your parents don't exist anymore." "I'll try to come see her," I said, hating how weak I sounded. That night, I gathered my courage and approached Tom. "My father called today," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My mother is very sick. I'd like to visit her." Tom's face darkened. "Absolutely not. We've been over this, Janet. They're not part of our lives anymore." I retreated, tears stinging my eyes. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling more alone than ever. Despite my worry and guilt, I decided not to argue with Tom. I didn't go to see my mother. A year passed, filled with regret and anxiety. Then another call came. "Janet," my father's voice was hollow this time. "Your mother, she's dying. The doctors say it's a matter of days now." This time, I couldn't stay silent. I approached Tom again, desperation in my voice. "Please, Tom, my mother is dying. I need to say goodbye." Tom glared at me, his jaw clenched. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Fine," he spat. "One day. That's all you get." Relief washed over me, mixed with a sadness so deep it threatened to overwhelm me. I called Jake immediately. "Jake, honey," I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your grandmother is dying. I'm going to see her tomorrow. Will you come with me?" There was only a moment's pause before Jake replied, "Of course, Mom. I'll be there." The next morning, Jake and I drove to my parents' house. My heart was pounding as we walked in. The house smelled of disinfectant and sadness. My mother lay in a hospital bed in the living room, looking small and frail. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. "Janet," she whispered, "my baby girl." I rushed to her side, taking her hand in mine. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. Can you ever forgive me?" She smiled weakly. "There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart. You're here now." We talked for hours. I introduced her to Jake, now a grown man she barely knew. We shared memories, laughed a little, and cried a lot. As the sun began to set, my mother's breathing became labored. I held her hand tightly, and she looked at me one last time. "I love you, Janet," she said softly, and then she was gone, slipping away peacefully in my arms. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I cried until I had no tears left, Jake's comforting arm around my shoulders. When I finally looked up, I saw my father standing in the doorway, his face a mask of pain. I went to him, and we held each other, sharing our sorrow. In that moment, I realized how much he'd aged, and how lost he looked without my mother by his side. "I'm staying for a few days, Dad," I said, "to help with everything." He nodded gratefully, and I stepped away to call Tom. My hand shook as I dialed. "I'm staying for a few days," I told him when he answered, "for the funeral, and to help Dad." "Like hell you are." Tom growled. "You get back here right now, Janet." "I mean it." For the first time in our marriage, I stood my ground. "No, Tom, I'm staying." I hung up before he could argue further. The day of the funeral arrived. As we stood around my mother's grave, my phone kept ringing. Tom's name flashed on the screen again and again. I ignored it, focusing on saying goodbye to my mother. Then in the midst of the eulogy, I accidentally hit the speaker phone button. Tom's voice blared out, loud and angry. "Janet, you better get your ass home right now, or I swear to God I'll come and drag you back myself, you ungrateful, disobedient scum. Who do you think you are?" The gathered mourners stared in shock. Jake's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. My father looked like he'd been slapped, burning with shame. I fumbled with the phone, finally managing to turn it off. My face was scarlet as I looked around at the stunned faces of friends and family. After the shocking phone call, my father gently took my arm and led me away from the crowd. Jake followed close behind, his face a mix of concern and anger. "Janet," my father said softly, his eyes searching mine. Does Tom always speak to you like that? I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, shame washing over me. For a moment, I considered lying, maintaining the facade I'd kept up for so long. But looking into my father's kind eyes, I couldn't do it anymore. Yes, I whispered, tears welling up. That's how he usually treats me. Jake's sharp intake of breath made me turn to him. Mom, he said, his voice cracking. I had no idea. I mean, sometimes things seemed off, but I never thought. I nodded, wiping away a tear. You're right, honey. I'm sorry I never told you. My father's face hardened. Janet, listen to me. There's something you need to know about Tom. When he worked for me years ago, I caught him stealing. Not just from the company, but from clients too. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What? Dad nodded grimly. He was inflating prices after contracts were signed, adding fake services. He'd overcharge customers and pocket the difference. My mind reeled. All these years, Tom had painted himself as the victim, and I'd believed him. I'd cut off my own parents because of his lies. There's more, my father continued. I recently heard from a friend that Tom's current company is under investigation. They've already found discrepancies and violations. I'd bet my last dollar Tom's behind it all. The pieces were falling into place. Years of manipulation and deceit became clear. I felt sick to my stomach. Just then, my phone rang again. Tom's name flashed on the screen. With shaking hands, I answered and put it on speaker. Janet, if you don't come home right now, we're through. You hear me? Divorced. Tom's voice was shrill with anger. My mother's birthday is tomorrow, and we're celebrating at our house. You better be here to organize everything and prepare the food. Don't you dare embarrass me. Before I could respond, my father leaned in, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. Don't worry, Tom. Janet will be there, and so will I. We've got a few things to discuss. Jake stepped forward, his jaw set. Count me in too. Mom, it's time we had a family meeting. The day after my mother's funeral, Dad, Jake, and I drove to my house. My stomach was in knots, but I felt stronger with them by my side. As we pulled up, I saw several cars parked outside. We walked in to find the living room full of people. Martha's friends were gathered around, chattering and laughing. Martha herself sat in the center like a queen holding court. When she spotted me, her face twisted into a scowl. Well, look who finally decided to show up, she sneered. You're late. My guests need to be served. Before I could respond, she snatched a rag from the table and threw it at me. Make yourself useful and wipe down the table now. I caught the rag reflexively, years of obedience kicking in. But then I heard my father's voice, low and dangerous. How dare you speak to my daughter that way? He growled, stepping forward. Martha laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Your daughter, please. Janet is married now. We're her family, not you. Now get out of our house and stop ruining my birthday. My father's face reddened. Your house? I think you're mistaken, Martha. I own this house. I gave it to Janet as a wedding gift, and I'm telling you all to leave now. The room fell silent. Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Just then, Tom walked in, his face darkening as he took in the scene. Janet, he snarled. What's going on here? Take your father and get out. You're ruining Mother's party. Something snapped inside me. Years of pent-up frustration and anger came pouring out. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. No, Tom, I said, my voice steady. You get out. Here are divorce papers. I don't want to see you or your mother ever again. This is my house, and I want you both to leave. Tom's face went pale, then red with rage. But before he could speak, I turned to the guests and told them I've been treated like a servant in my own home for years. Jake confirmed every word I said. The guests shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. I saw looks of sympathy, shock, and in some cases, dawning understanding. "Get out," I repeated, looking directly at Tom and Martha. "All of you, please leave." To my surprise, Martha's friends started gathering their things. A few even muttered apologies as they hurried past. Tom and Martha stood frozen, disbelief etched on their faces. "This isn't over," Tom hissed as he finally moved towards the door, practically dragging his mother with him. As the door closed behind them, a profound silence fell over the house. Then slowly, I felt a smile spread across my face. For the first time in years, I felt free. In the weeks following the confrontation at my house, life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and paperwork. I barely had time to process everything when news broke about Tom's company. The audit had been completed, and the results were damning. Just as my father had suspected, Tom's fraudulent activities were exposed. The evidence was overwhelming, and Tom was convicted. The judge's words still ring in my ears. "You will no longer be permitted to hold any senior positions in any company." My divorce lawyer, a fierce woman named Sarah, encouraged me to seek compensation. "You've endured years of emotional abuse and humiliation," she said. "You deserve restitution." I was hesitant at first, but Jake and Dad urged me on. In the end, the court agreed. Between the criminal charges and the divorce settlement, Tom found himself buried in debt. It was a strange feeling knowing the tables had turned so completely. With the divorce finalized and the legal battles behind me, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I sold the house. Too many painful memories lingered there. Dad insisted I move in with him, but the biggest change came when Dad invited me to work with him. "It's time you learned the family business," he said one morning over coffee. "What do you say?" I was terrified at first. I'd been out of the workforce for so long, and Tom's voice in my head kept telling me I was useless. But Dad was patient and encouraging. He showed me the ropes, explained the intricacies of running the affordable housing business he built. To my surprise, I took to it like a duck to water. Years of managing a household translated well to project management. My empathy helped in dealing with clients and employees alike. Dad beamed with pride every time I successfully closed a deal or solved a tricky problem. 3 years flew by. Then on a crisp autumn morning, my world shifted again. Dad passed away in his sleep, peaceful and painless. The grief was overwhelming, but this time I wasn't alone. I had Jake, I had friends, I had a life of my own. As we sorted through Dad's affairs, we discovered he'd left everything to me. The business, the house, all of it. I sat in his office, now mine, looking at the photos on the wall. Mom and Dad on their wedding day, me as a little girl, Jake's graduation photo, and a new one. Dad and me at the ribbon cutting of our latest housing project. "You've made me so proud," he'd said that day. "You're going to do great things." Sitting there, I made a silent promise to him. I would continue his legacy, but more than that, I would build my own. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I'd never dreamed of just a few years ago. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and felt my blood run cold. There stood Tom, older and a bit more weathered, but with that same manipulative glint in his eye. "Janet," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry for your loss." I stood frozen, my hand gripping the doorknob. Tom took my silence as an invitation and stepped closer. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he continued. "I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I've changed. My mother passed away last year, and it made me realize what's truly important in life. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back instinctively. "We could be happy again, Janet," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "There's nothing standing in our way now. We could love each other again like we used to." For a moment, I was transported back to the scared, submissive woman I used to be. Then something bubbled up inside me, a laugh. It started small but grew until I was doubled over, tears in my eyes. Tom's face contorted in confusion, then anger. "What's so funny?" he demanded. I stood up straight and wiped my eyes. "Tom, you are. The notion that, despite all you've done, you can stroll back into my life. The reality that you haven't altered in any way." His expression grew serious. "Now listen here, Janet." "No, you listen," I interrupted, maintaining a firm and steady tone. "Please leave my home. I forgot my address. I am forgotten. Because I'm going to call the cops if you ever come around here again." I took out my phone and began to dial in an attempt to make my point clear. Tom's stunned eyes grew wider. This was not the submissive Janet he recalled. I heard him swear beneath his breath as he stormed off. I took a deep, soothing breath as I shut the door. I was scared by the experience, but I also felt oddly strong. My biggest fear had been sent packing once I had faced it. My phone rang at that moment, and it was Jake's text. "Mom, wonderful news. Sarah is expecting. You will become a grandma." Emotion rushed through me, erasing the remaining traces of my interaction with Tom. Jake's wife was a lovely woman who he married 2 years ago. I gave Jake a call right away, and we had a great conversation for an hour on baby names and nursery colors. After several months, Jake and Sarah returned to the city. Jake said, "We want our child to grow up close to family." I was ecstatic to have them around. We poured ourselves into the family company together. The firm was given new life by Sarah's marketing skills and Jake's innovative ideas. Our affordable housing developments grew, and before long, demand for our houses was great throughout the state. I was filled with pride and pleasure as I stood at the building site of our newest development and watched the frames of future homes rise against the sky. Little Tommy, my grandson, gurgled in my arms and tried to grasp hold of my hard helmet. "See that, Tommy?" I whispered. "That's your great-grandpa's legacy, and someday it'll be yours too." I grinned to myself as the sun started to set, illuminating the worksite with a pleasant light. This was a new beginning and a new chapter, not just for myself, but for future generations as well. It was more than simply a company, and I was prepared for whatever experiences that were ahead.